I thought I was content with the quiet, 15 years of solitude on my farm, safe in the predictability of my routines. Then Caleb arrived, a rugged stranger stranded by a landslide, and my carefully guarded world shifted. One night turned into something more. Beneath the firelight, with the weight of his gaze and the heat between us, I felt something I hadn't in years. Alive, vulnerable, and utterly undone. I didn't expect him to stay. I didn't expect to want him to, but some moments ignite a fire you can't ignore, no matter how much you try. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The sky was a soft gradient of orange and pink as I leaned against the fence, sipping the last of my coffee. The evening air was thick with the smell of freshly turned soil and the faint sweetness of wildflowers carried by a gentle breeze. It was the kind of moment that reminded me why I stayed out here, away from the noise of the world. The stillness was mine, a constant I'd come to depend on. 15 years had passed since I packed my life into boxes and left the city, my divorce papers signed and the promises I once thought were unbreakable reduced to legal jargon. At first, I hated the emptiness out here, the way the silence echoed in my chest. But over time, the farm became a refuge, a place where I could work with my hands and let the rhythm of the seasons guide my days. I set the empty mug on the porch railing and watched the cattle meandering back toward the barn, their low calls blending into the soft hum of crickets. There was something reassuring about their routine, their predictability. The farm had no room for chaos or surprises. Every day was a repetition of the last. Work the fields, mend the fences, check the cattle, and end the day with a quiet drink on the porch. And I liked it that way. "Come on, Daisy," I called, watching my old border collie trot up from the pasture. She was slower these days, her joints stiff with age, but she still made her rounds with the same determination she had as a pup. Her wagging tail and the way her ears perked up at my voice brought a small smile to my face. I grabbed the last of the feed from the storage shed and walked toward the barn, the gravel crunching under my boots. The barn door groaned as I slid it open, revealing the familiar smell of hay and animals. I tossed the feed into the troughs and leaned against a post, listening to the contented sounds of the cattle settling in for the night. Afterward, I made my way back to the house, the fading light casting long shadows across the fields. The farmhouse stood like a sentinel, its white paint chipped and its roof in need of a patch job. It wasn't much to look at, but it was home. Inside, the ticking of the old wall clock greeted me, marking the passing hours with an unrelenting rhythm. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sank into the worn armchair by the window, letting the familiar burn settle in my chest. Outside, the stars were beginning to show, scattered like tiny pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. I wondered if anyone else was looking up at them, thinking about the same things I was. Probably not. Most people had families, plans, and distractions to fill their evenings. I had the quiet, and for the most part it was enough. But every now and then, there was a tug, an ache I didn't like to acknowledge. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that came from being alone. It was deeper than that. A hollow space that reminded me of the life I used to have, the one I thought I'd grow old in. I finished my whiskey and leaned my head back against the chair, closing my eyes. Tomorrow would be the same as today. Up with the sun, chores to do, and the steady beat of the farm to keep me moving forward. It was simple, it was predictable, and it was mine. With that thought, I stood, turned off the lamp, and headed upstairs to bed. Daisy followed me, her nails clicking softly against the wood floor. As I pulled the quilt over myself and let the darkness settle in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The engine growled low under the hood as I eased the truck down the dirt road. The headlights cut through the dim twilight, bouncing over the uneven terrain. I'd taken this detour dozens of times before. It was rougher but shorter than the main road, and it let me check the southern pasture without going out of my way. Normally, Daisy would be in the passenger seat, but these days I left her home when the terrain got too rough. Her hips couldn't handle the jolts anymore. The cab was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of gravel under the tires. I liked it that way. The stillness of the countryside suited me. No traffic. No people in a hurry to get somewhere. Out here, everything moved at its own pace. I was just about to crest the hill when I saw it. A pair of hazard lights blinked in the distance, throwing off a muted, rhythmic glow against the trees. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. As I got closer, the outline of a massive truck came into view, its rear end tilted at an odd angle where the road narrowed near a shallow ditch. A landslide had spilled loose dirt and rocks across the path, blocking any way forward. I pulled up a few yards behind it and parked. Stepping out, I felt the chill of the evening settle into my jacket. The air smelled damp, like it might rain later. "Need a hand?" I called out. The sound of heavy boots crunching over gravel answered me before the man did. He stepped into the light of my truck's high beams, his silhouette cutting a broad, solid figure. The first thing I noticed was his posture. Rigid, shoulders squared as if bracing for a fight. "I don't suppose you've got a shovel and a miracle in that truck of yours," he said, his voice carrying a low, gravelly tone that matched the landscape. I glanced at the mess ahead of us. The landslide wasn't massive, but it was enough to make moving a semi-truck impossible without heavy equipment. "Not sure a shovel's gonna cut it," I said, walking closer. "You stuck." He nodded, his face coming into view as he stepped out of the shadows. Dark stubble lined his jaw, and his eyes, sharp and unreadable, flicked over me like he was sizing me up. "The road's blocked. Can't go forward, can't go back. Mud's too soft to turn around. Hell of a night." I nodded toward the cab. "How long you been here?" "Couple hours," he said. "Was hoping someone'd come by sooner." He crossed his arms, leaning against the side of the truck like he was trying to decide whether he trusted me. "Well, there's no getting through tonight," I said. "Not unless you've got a bulldozer hidden somewhere. Best bet is to wait for the county to clear it in the morning." His mouth pressed into a thin line, and I could see the frustration creeping into his expression. "Figures. Guess I'll be sleeping in the truck, then." The thought didn't sit right with me. The temperature was dropping fast, and the nearest town was miles away. I wasn't about to leave someone stranded, no matter how self-sufficient they looked. "You don't have to do that," I offered. "My place is just a few miles back. You're welcome to crash there for the night. Beats freezing out here." He raised an eyebrow, the slightest hint of skepticism crossing his face. "You always invite stranded strangers into your home?" "Not usually," I admitted. "But I don't see much of a choice tonight. You can take it or leave it." For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at me like he was trying to decide if I was worth the risk. Finally, he gave a short nod. "All right, thanks. Name's Caleb." "Elliot," I replied, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his palm rough and calloused, the handshake lasting just a beat longer than necessary. I helped him gather a few things from the cab, a duffel bag, a thermos, and a heavy jacket. As he followed me back to my truck, I couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself. Like a man who wasn't used to accepting help, even when he needed it. We rode back in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. My mind wandered as the headlights carved a path through the darkness. Something about Caleb's presence unsettled me, not in a bad way, but in a way that left me curious. He was a stranger, sure, but there was a weight to him, a story hidden beneath his quiet exterior. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the stars were out in full force, scattered across the sky like flecks of silver. As I led Caleb inside, Daisy's bark greeted us from the living room. The farmhouse felt smaller with him standing there, his broad frame taking up space in a way I wasn't used to. I wasn't sure why, but I felt something shift as I watched him glance around, his eyes settling briefly on me. It was like the stillness of my life had been disrupted, and for the first time in years I didn't mind. I held the door open for Caleb, letting him step inside first. His boots thudded heavily on the wooden floor as he glanced around, taking in the modest interior. The farmhouse wasn't much, Just a living room with a weathered couch and a couple of mismatched chairs, a small kitchen tucked into one corner, and a staircase leading to the second floor. It was tidy, but its age showed in the creak of the floorboards and the peeling paint around the windows. Daisy shuffled out from her spot near the fire, tail wagging weakly as she sniffed the air. Caleb crouched down to greet her, his large hand smoothing over her head. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice softening for the first time since we met. "She's old," I said, setting my hat on the rack. "Doesn't move as fast as she used to, but she's got a good heart." "She's a beauty," Caleb replied, scratching behind Daisy's ears before standing and letting his gaze wander again. "You can put your stuff down by the couch," I offered, motioning to the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "I'll get a fire going. Nights out here can get cold." Caleb nodded and set his bag down carefully, as if trying not to disturb anything. It was strange having someone else in the house. The space felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling the quiet corners I'd grown used to. As I stacked a few logs in the fireplace and coaxed the flames to life, I could feel his eyes on me. Not in an obvious way, but enough to make me aware of how close we were in the confined room. "You don't get many visitors, do you?" he asked, breaking the silence. I chuckled softly. "That obvious?" "Yeah," he said, leaning against the back of the couch. "Place looks lived in, but it's got that quiet feel, like it's just yours." I sat back on my heels, dusting ash off my hands. "It is. Been on my own for a while now. Got used to the quiet, I guess." Caleb tilted his head, studying me in a way that felt oddly personal. "Don't you get tired of it?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but there's a peace to it."
No expectations. No noise.
Simple. Predictable. He didn't respond right away, just looked toward the fire. The flickering light softened his features, highlighting the lines etched into his face from years of hard work and long roads. There was a weight in his silence, like he understood what I meant but didn't quite agree. "You hungry?" I asked, getting to my feet. "Starving," he said with a faint grin. I headed to the kitchen and started pulling things together. The pantry wasn't exactly stocked with anything fancy, but I could make do. I settled on frying up some eggs and bacon, adding a couple of slices of bread for toast. Caleb stood by the counter, watching me move around the small space. "You always cook for strangers. Or am I just lucky?" he asked, his tone teasing but his expression serious. I smirked. "Depends on the stranger. You don't seem like the kind who'd poison me in my sleep." "Not tonight, anyway," he said, his lips curving into a slight smile. The food was simple but filling, and we ate by the fire. Daisy curled up at Caleb's feet, snoring softly, while the crackle of the logs filled the room. "So," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what's a guy like you doing out here? Doesn't seem like truckers usually take these back roads." Caleb leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Hauling a load to a farm a few counties over. Thought I'd save some time cutting through here. Guess I miscalculated." "Guess so," I said with a chuckle. "Where you from?" "Nowhere, really," he said, swirling the last of his coffee in the mug. "Been on the road for years. Left home young, and the job's kept me moving ever since." "Don't you ever want to stop? Settle down somewhere?" He shrugged, but his eyes flicked to the fire. "Sometimes, but settling down ain't as easy as people make it sound. Takes more than a house to feel at home." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. There was something in the way he said it, like he was speaking from a place I recognized all too well. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I get that." We didn't talk much more after that. The fire burned low, and the warmth of the room settled into my bones. Caleb stretched and stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Where am I sleeping?" he asked. I gestured toward the couch. "It's not fancy, but it's comfortable enough. Sheets and a blanket are in the chest over there." "Thanks," he said, grabbing the bedding and tossing it over the couch. As I headed upstairs to my room, I glanced back. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the couch, staring into the dying embers of the fire. There was something about him, something quiet and guarded, but not unkind. It was strange, having someone else in the house. Stranger still that I didn't mind. The smell of coffee hit me first the next morning. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting up the stairs like a quiet invitation. I sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. For a second, I almost forgot there was someone else in the house, until the faint creak of the floorboards reminded me. I dressed quickly, throwing on my usual jeans and flannel, and made my way downstairs. Caleb was in the kitchen, standing by the stove with his back to me. He moved with practiced ease, like he'd done this 100 times in kitchens that weren't his own. "Didn't take you for a morning person," I said, leaning against the doorway. He turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder. "Didn't figure you'd mind some coffee." I didn't. The pot was already half full, and the rich aroma filled the small kitchen. Caleb poured me a mug and slid it across the counter. "Thought I'd repay the hospitality," he said. "Appreciate it," I replied, taking a sip. The coffee was strong, black, and exactly what I needed. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness I usually welcomed. But with Caleb here, it felt different. Not unwelcome, just different. We sipped our coffee in silence, the occasional rustle of Daisy shifting on her blanket the only sound. "You always this quiet in the morning?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Depends," I said with a shrug. "Not much to say most days." He smirked faintly, like he understood that more than he let on. The chores couldn't wait, so I pulled on my boots and headed out to the barn. Caleb followed without a word, his steps steady behind me. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the dewy grass. "You don't have to help," I told him as we reached the barn. "I don't mind," he said simply, and he didn't. Without needing much direction, he jumped in, grabbing hay bales and hauling them to the feeding troughs like he'd been doing it for years. I watched him for a moment, the ease in his movements, the way he tackled the work without complaint. "You ever work a farm before?" I asked as we loaded feed into the troughs. "A little," he said. "Did some odd jobs when I was younger. Never stayed anywhere long enough to stick with it." "Well, you're a natural," I said, meaning it. The morning passed quickly with him around. The work felt lighter somehow, like having someone to share the load made it easier to carry. By the time we finished, the sun was high, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. We settled on the porch with tall glasses of water, the ice clinking softly as we drank. Daisy sprawled out at my feet, her tongue lolling from the heat. "You've got a good setup here," Caleb said, glancing out at the fields. "Quiet, steady. Bet it beats the hell out of life on the road." "Most days, yeah," I replied. "But it's not always easy. Loneliness has a way of creeping in when you least expect it." He nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Loneliness'll do that. Doesn't matter where you are." His words struck a chord, one I didn't expect. I studied him for a moment, trying to piece together the man sitting next to me. There was something in his tone, a kind of knowing that went beyond casual conversation. "You ever think about settling down somewhere?" I asked. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Thought about it," he admitted. "But I don't know if it's in me. Been moving for so long. It's like I forgot how to stay still." I nodded, understanding more than I cared to admit. Staying still ain't as easy as people think. The quiet. It's not always peaceful. He glanced at me then, his gaze steady. "But you make it work." "Most days," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. The conversation hung between us, heavier than it should have been. It wasn't the kind of thing I usually talked about. Not with strangers, not with anyone. But with Caleb, it felt natural, like he'd already seen enough of the truth to make hiding it pointless. As the afternoon stretched on, the tension from the night before began to ease. We worked side by side in the yard, fixing a section of the fence that had come loose and clearing brush near the edge of the property. Caleb worked without complaint, his strength and skill showing in the way he tackled each task. By the time the sun started to dip low, the fence was patched, and the yard looked better than it had in months. We stood side by side, leaning on the tools we'd been using, watching the sky turn shades of amber and crimson. "Not a bad day," Caleb said, his tone light for the first time since he'd arrived. "Not bad at all," I replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. It was strange how easily he'd fit into the rhythm of the day, like he belonged here more than I'd have expected. Watching him now, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the evening light, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd already left a mark on this place, and on me. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting a pale light over the farmhouse as I finished shutting things down for the night. Daisy had already curled up by the fire, snoring softly, and Caleb was in the bathroom. The sound of running water echoed faintly through the house, mingling with the creaks and groans of the old wood settling for the night. I leaned against the kitchen counter, nursing the last sip of whiskey from my glass. The day had been good, easier than most, but the weight of its quiet moments lingered. There was something about Caleb's presence that had disrupted the stillness of my life. Not in a bad way, but in a way that felt unsettled. The sound of the water stopped, and for a moment, the house fell silent again. I set the glass down and wandered toward the stairs, my mind more on the day's events than where I was going. The bathroom door was cracked open, just enough to catch the warm light spilling into the hallway. Before I could think twice, I knocked lightly, intending to let Caleb know I'd set out fresh towels earlier. But my knuckles barely brushed the wood when the door creaked open wider. He was there, standing by the sink, a towel slung loosely around his waist. His back was to me broad and bare, still damp from the shower. The soft yellow light cast shadows over the planes of his shoulders, emphasizing the strength in his frame. Water dripped lazily from his hair, tracing lines down his skin before disappearing into the towel. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the sight of him, it was the intimacy of the moment. The vulnerability of seeing someone without their usual armor, exposed in a way they hadn't intended. He noticed me before I could move, turning slightly to meet my gaze. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes steady and searching. For a second, neither of us said anything. The air between us was thick, the quiet louder than anything else in the house. "Everything all right?" His voice was low, calm, but there was something beneath it, a quiet tension, like he was testing the waters. "Yeah," I said quickly, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." His gaze didn't waver, but the corner of his mouth lifted in the faintest hint of a smile. "I'm good, thanks." I nodded, forcing myself to look away, but the image of him was burned into my mind. The curve of his shoulders, the lines of his muscles, the way the light caught on the drops of water clinging to his skin. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the door as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. "All right, well, good night." "Good night," he replied, his voice softer this time. I pulled the door closed and retreated down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I barely made it back to my room before the weight of the moment hit me. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I buried my face in my hands, trying to make sense of the swirl of emotions. It wasn't just the physicality of it, the broad strength of him, the raw humanity of seeing someone unguarded. It was something deeper, something I hadn't felt in years. Desire, maybe, or the kind of yearning that made you question everything you thought you'd settled into. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in my mind. Caleb had been a stranger less than 24 hours ago, a face I'd never seen and a name I'd never spoken. And yet here he was, already taking up more space in my life than I thought possible. The way he looked at me just now, calm, steady, unflinching. It stirred something in me I didn't know was still there. Sleep came slowly that night, the echo of his gaze lingering long after I closed my eyes. The house was still when I woke. Faint light filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the bedroom walls. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, the events of the night before replaying in my mind. Caleb's face, his steady gaze, the charged silence between us. It all lingered like a dream I couldn't shake. I rolled out of bed, tugged on my boots, and headed downstairs. The smell of coffee was missing this time, replaced by the familiar quiet hum of the house. I found Caleb outside, leaning against the porch railing, a mug in his hand. He turned as I stepped outside, nodding in acknowledgement. "Mornin'," he said, his voice low and easy. "Morning," I replied, joining him. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. "You're up early." "Habit," he said simply. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, the fields stretching out before us like a painting. The sun had just begun to rise, washing everything in soft gold. "Thanks for letting me crash here," Caleb said, breaking the quiet. His tone was sincere, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Didn't expect, well, any of this." "Don't mention it," I said. "It's not every day I have company. Guess I should be thanking you for shaking things up around here." He smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Doesn't seem like you're the kind of guy who likes things shaken up." I shrugged. "Maybe not. But sometimes it's good to be reminded there's more to life than routine." His gaze shifted to me then, sharp and searching. "That why you live out here? For the routine?" I hesitated, the question striking deeper than I expected. "At first, yeah. After my divorce, I needed something predictable. Something steady." I paused, unsure why I was opening up to him. "But it's more than that now. Out here it's mine. No one else's expectations. Just me." Caleb nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Makes sense." "And you?" I asked, glancing at him. "Why stay on the road so long?" He took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Because staying in one place, it's hard to trust it'll last. Feels safer to keep moving." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I didn't press him further, sensing the weight behind them. Instead, we settled back into silence, the kind that felt less awkward and more shared. The day passed in much the same way as the last. Chores, quiet conversations, and moments of unspoken understanding. By evening, we found ourselves back in the living room, the fire crackling softly. Daisy had taken her usual spot near the hearth, her gentle snores filling the room. Caleb sat across from me, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. I couldn't help but watch him, the way the firelight danced across his face, highlighting the hard edges and soft lines. "Got something on your mind?" he asked, his tone light but his gaze direct. "Just wondering," I said, choosing my words carefully. "What happens after this? When the road clears?" He tilted his head, studying me. "I guess I'll move on. Got places to be, people waiting on deliveries." "Right?" I said, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest at the thought. "What about you?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "You ever think about not being alone out here?" I chuckled softly, but it held no real humor. "Sometimes, but the longer I'm out here, the harder it is to imagine letting someone in." "Funny," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Seems like you've already done that." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said quietly, though my voice betrayed me. Caleb set his mug down and stood, moving to the hearth. He crouched to add another log to the fire, his movements deliberate. When he turned back, his gaze locked on mine, unflinching. "Yeah, you do," he said simply. The room seemed to shift, the distance between us shrinking. Couldn't look away, couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't betray the truth I'd been avoiding. He crossed the space between us in a few easy steps, standing in front of me. "Elliot," he said, his voice low, steady. "You can push people away your whole life, or you can let someone in." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "And what if it doesn't last?" "Then it doesn't," he said. "But at least you tried." There was no hesitation in his movements as he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was simple, unassuming, but it carried more weight than I was prepared for. I didn't pull away. For the first time in years, I let myself feel something more than just the quiet comfort of my routine. And as Caleb sat down beside me, the firelight flickering against the walls, I realized that maybe, just maybe, letting someone in wasn't as terrifying as I thought. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation, shared laughter, and moments of closeness that felt as natural as they did unexpected. By the time we turned in for the night, the space between us felt smaller, the silence less lonely. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't dread the morning. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the faint smell of coffee. It drifted through the house, warm and familiar, pulling me from the kind of deep sleep I hadn't had in years. I stretched under the quilt, letting the memory of the previous night settle over me like a second layer of warmth. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of the house waking up. The low creak of floorboards, the faint clink of a mug against the counter. The presence of someone else moving through my space should have felt strange, intrusive even. But it didn't. Felt right. When I finally made my way downstairs, Caleb was at the stove, a spatula in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. He looked over his shoulder as I entered, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Morning," he said. "Hope you're hungry." "You didn't have to do that," I replied, though the sight of bacon sizzling in the pan made my stomach rumble. "I owed you," he said simply, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "Figured it's the least I could do." I grabbed a mug from the counter and poured myself some coffee, the strong aroma waking me up even more. "If I'd known you could cook, I would have put you to work in the kitchen sooner." He chuckled, a low sound that felt like it settled into the air around us. "Don't get used to it," he said, though his tone was more teasing than serious. We ate together at the small kitchen table, the kind of easy silence between us that didn't need to be filled with words. Daisy lingered nearby, her head resting on Caleb's knee, clearly won over by his presence. "So," I said finally, breaking the quiet, "what's the plan for today?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. "The county should have cleared the road by now. I'll head out after breakfast, get back on schedule." The words settled heavily in my chest, even though I'd known they were coming. This was always going to be temporary, a single night, a brief crossing of paths before he moved on to the next stretch of road. But still, the thought of him leaving hit harder than I expected. "Right?" I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Caleb's eyes flicked to me, sharp and observant. "What about you? Back to the usual routine?" I nodded. "Same as always. Not much changes around here." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Sometimes, consistency's better than chasing something you'll never catch." "Maybe," I replied, though the words felt hollow. We finished breakfast, and I helped him clean up, our movements easy and familiar, like we'd been doing this for years instead of just a single morning. When the dishes were done, Caleb grabbed his duffel bag from the couch and slung it over his shoulder. I followed him out to the porch, the morning sun casting long shadows across the yard. His truck stood waiting in the driveway, a stark reminder that his time here was nearly up. "Well," he said, turning to face me, "thanks for everything. I mean it." "Don't mention it," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "Safe travels." For a moment, neither of us moved. The quiet stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I reached out, gripping his shoulder. "You take care of yourself out there," I said. He nodded, his hand coming up to cover mine briefly. "You too, Elliot." And then, as if something had shifted, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft but full of meaning. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd shared, and everything we might never say aloud. When he pulled back, his gaze lingered on mine for a moment longer. Then he turned and climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life. I stood on the porch, watching as he pulled out onto the road and disappeared into the distance. The house felt quieter than it had in a long time, the kind of silence that was both comforting and achingly empty. I went back inside, pouring myself another cup of coffee and settling into my usual chair by the window. Daisy padded over and laid her head on my knee, her eyes watching me with the same quiet understanding she always had. The morning sunlight streamed in, highlighting the dust motes drifting lazily through the air. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but think about Caleb, his easy smile, the way he carried himself, the way he'd left a mark on this place and on me in such a short time. The road had cleared and he was gone, but the memory of him lingered. And as I sat there, staring out at the fields, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A quiet, cautious hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was just the beginning. The days after Caleb left passed like they always did, marked by the steady rhythm of farm life. Each morning, I rose with the sun, worked through the day, and let the evenings drift into quiet reflection. But the silence wasn't the same anymore. It carried a weight it hadn't before. A mixture of longing and something I could only describe as hope. I caught myself looking at the driveway more often than I wanted to admit, as if expecting his truck to reappear over the horizon. It didn't, of course. Caleb was back on the road, miles away, with a life and responsibilities far removed from my little corner of the world. Still, he lingered. In the quiet moments, his voice played in my mind, the gravelly tone of it wrapping around my thoughts. I'd see him in the smallest things, the extra coffee mug left on the counter, the firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, even the patch of fence he'd helped fix. Daisy seemed to notice the difference too. She wandered the house more than usual, her tail wagging faintly whenever the sound of a passing truck echoed in the distance. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, the phone buzzed against the table. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize, but something in my gut told me to answer. Elliot. Caleb's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. I sat up straighter, the sound of his voice hitting me harder than I expected. Caleb, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. Didn't think I'd hear from you. Yeah, well, he said, a small chuckle carrying through the line. Didn't think I'd call. Guess I just wanted to check in. See how things are out there. Same as always, I said, glancing out at the fields. Quiet, predictable. You know how it is. I do, he said, his voice quieter now. Guess that's why I keep thinking about it. His words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking in slowly. I leaned back in the chair, staring up at the stars as they began to fill the darkening sky. You doing all right? I asked, keeping my tone light even though the question carried more weight than it seemed. I'm good, he said, but I'll be honest, it's been a long couple of days. Hard to keep my mind off the farm. And you? The confession was unexpected, hitting me like a jolt. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My grip tightened on the glass in my hand, the coolness of it grounding me. Yeah, I said finally, my voice quieter. Same here. The line went quiet for a beat, the sound of his breath faint but steady. Then he spoke again, his tone laced with something unspoken. I'm thinking about coming back through in a few weeks, if you don't mind. Mind? I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. Caleb, you're always welcome here. There was a soft laugh on the other end, the kind that felt like it carried more meaning than the words themselves. Good to know, he said. I'll let you know when I'm close. Looking forward to it, I replied, the smile growing despite myself. We said our goodbyes, the call ending far too soon. But even after the line went dead, I sat there for a long time, the whiskey untouched in my hand and the stars above shining brighter than they had in years. It wasn't much, just a phone call, a promise of something more. But it was enough to ease the ache that had settled in my chest since he'd driven away. As I sat there, I thought about the man who'd come into my life so unexpectedly and left a mark I couldn't ignore. Caleb wasn't like the quiet routines I'd built my life around. He was the unexpected, the unplanned, the change I didn't know I needed. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. The stillness of my life had been broken, and I didn't want to go back. The phone buzzed again, a text this time. 3 simple words lit up the screen. See you soon. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the horizon as a soft breeze rustled the trees. For the first time in a long time, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet anticipation for the road ahead. Whatever it was, I knew it would be worth the wait.